This is going to be a continuation of, I forget which episode, but the one before Hillman talking about, I was talking about episode 48 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And so today I'm going to talk about episode 49, and I'm going to try and do that a little bit more in my own terms rather than reading the transcript. And the reason that I'm invoking and presencing all of that is because I'm trying to understand more of, well, again, my way through to Robert Avens is blocked because I need to understand this term angel. And in order to do that, that I mean, Avens is taking that from Corbin, right? In order to do that, I need to understand. I need to get a little bit more facility with what is meant by the term imaginal that comes through Corbin and is relevant to Jung, and understanding the concept of the divine double, or which is equivalent to Vervaeke, sacred second self, Socratic daimonion, in Jung, the anima or soul, or in Corbin, the angel. They're kind of all equivalent ways of talking about the same thing. Yeah, and so the idea here, I think, is that by developing this facility with perspective taking, that one can take the perspectives not only of different parts within one, but of different, could say, centers of agency, that by being in relationship with the inhabitants of the imaginal world, that what is facilitated by that is transformative experience and gnosis. And that this can reasonably be considered, in fact, rationally be considered part of a process of aspiration toward becoming more wise. And so, like, if one doesn't understand, some facility with Vervaeke's work is definitely going to be helpful. Some awareness of the rest of this series is going to be helpful. Yeah, there's a lot of work that has had to be done before this point in order to get here. And if wasn't one isn't aware of that, then one probably isn't in a position to grasp what I'm getting at. I think for me, something I want to invoke is that, for me, the context of the metacrisis. And so for me, part of my interest in all this is not only to simply understand my own experience more deeply, but to understand how imaginal practice and participation in and through symbols in gnosis and the transformative experience and the sense of sacredness that arises from out of that process, how that is relevant to collective intelligence and group process. I was just over in the psychological type series and I was talking about the Jungian self as a transjective center of awareness. So the idea here might be something like that if we can take up or inhabit the perspective of the daemon or divine double or Jungian soul, that capacity for perspective taking affords or unlocks certain capacities. And what I mean is that by inhabiting such perspectives, one may be able to give birth or give rise to something through that. So the idea that by being in relationship with this, with a quote unquote higher self, and a relationship between finitude and transcendence, and aspirational development. Drew Hyland's book is also relevant here. Finitude and transcendence in the Platonic dialogues. And the idea may be not simply to take up that perspective, but to create from out of that perspective. So by assuming that identity, by taking on that agent arena embeddedness, I don't know how to say that one may be able to create in a different way, or something that cannot be created from our normal um, egoic perspective. And furthermore, that there may not simply be one figure, there may be multiple figures. For example, it's a kind of imaginal space or imaginal world that is populated by different figures, each of which can be related with and taken up as gainful perspectives that may unlock different affordances, one of which may be considered to be soul or anima. And so I think what we would see is different affordances being unlocked by the capacity to take up different perspectives, and that we would want to tread carefully in filling into those affordances and what's really made available and what's really made unavailable by different perspectives. And I want to connect that with group process by saying something like, not only is it possible to engage in group process from out of egoic perspectives or from out of daimonic perspectives, let's say, but we need to also be aware of the sort of latent reality of a transjective center of awareness, the consciousness of the group. And I think, again, over in the psychological type series, I was talking about the Jungian self in this context and talk about the Jungian self as this center of awareness, which is between and beneath duality, between conscious and unconscious, a deeper center of awareness. And when we understand that Jung's unconscious is extended rather than simply inside us, then I think it's easier to see how this transjective center of awareness becomes relevant to giving rise to the self. I mean that the emergence of the self in Jungian terms is a transjective process, and that constellating a transjective center of awareness may afford that. And then I could notice that it's fine to talk about transjectivity, but then I think we also have to talk about assuming a daimonic identity in a personal perspectival way from out of one's own personal perspective, but then in group process that's taken into a group dynamic, right? And there may also be constellated intersubjective center or centers of awareness, and those may need to be in dialogue. I'm talking here about the sort of spirit of the individual and spirit of the collective, each of which can be sort of imaginally augmented. And again, the Jungian self is that which is between and beneath all, or above and beyond all duality that arises as a result of facility with perspective taking and deeper participation through symbol in being, in life, in awareness. And so I'm wanting to be careful to avoid equating what I mean by the union self as a transjective center of awareness with an intersubjective center or with a daimon. And the idea would be that by getting such group process, not simply a process of personal aspiration, because I'm conscious of the risk of inflation and egocentrism and like that. When we start to map this out in this way, well, what are we really interested in? What are we really looking for? I'm interested in a process that allows people to practice taking different perspectives, that facilitates their aspirational development, that helps people to become more wise, and that can actually not only successively resolve different pairs of opposites into a sort of higher order unity of some kind, but that actually can solve real problems in the world. Not only give people a sense of meaning and connection and belonging and fulfillment and like that, not only a sense of coherence and significance and purpose and mattering and access to the sense of meaning and sacredness, gnosis, but that can actually result in greater facility with creative problem solving. The idea being that in order to navigate through the bottleneck of the metacrisis, meaning crisis combination, we're going to need these specific kinds of group processes to constellate in a certain way toward a certain end. Feel reluctant to name that end, but it's not just fun. It's not just interesting. It's not just exciting. It might be exactly what we need, and indeed there might be no other way. And I don't want to be naive about that because we want to be carefully looking at, well, what actually happens? Are people actually changed for the better? What actually is the result as scientists, let's say? So those are some pieces that I feel are important. Now, what I'm going to do is, well, hang on one second. Like so. Okay. So I'm going to try not to read from the transcripts and instead try to sort of bridge from last time and talk more about this process of, first of all, aspirational development and non-logical identity. So the idea here is that we're trying to get a facility with what gnosis is and its relevance, its importance to us. That gnosis is essentially deeply connected with a form of transformative participatory knowing and that it's a sort of it's a place, or it's a certain depth of being that evokes and involves transformation and transformative experience and a sense of sacredness, and that in order to have facility with that place, serious play is required. Again, I've talked about this in terms of the attitude of not just attitude, the disposition to take the perspective of the soul, to be able to be in childlikeness, to be in wonder, to be in serious play, to be in spontaneity. And that the imaginal practice is tied to that. That imaginal practice goes together with that. Again, the imaginal is tying together objective and subjective, abstract and sensory, and the imaginal is distinct from the imagination because it's more binding, more connecting to reality rather than fantasy that takes us away from reality. Okay, so symbols are deeply involved in this. I think the importance here is that what I would say is by assuming these different perspectives, by learning to do that, one has a better facility with the creation of symbols. One can be more creative of symbols, and that they can, but do not always have to come from the Jungian self, this transjective center of awareness, and that those symbols therefore help us to get in touch with that. However, it's also true that the daimon, or the divine double, or the angel, is itself a symbol. I talked about this in the episodes with Jung on Christianity, where Christ is a God image to Jung, and the soul is a God image to Jung. It's a similar sort of thing. This is kind of what we mean by symbol. Again, yeah, so it becomes tricky to talk about because symbolic cognition is so deep to our being. So it's like by taking the perspective of something that can be regarded as a symbol, by taking on a symbolic identity, connections to drama, to ritual, to myth, then it's possible to unlock certain affordances that have to do with a creative capacity that can give rise to more symbol of a different kind. This process deeply involves co-transformation of self and world, not simply self-transformation or quote self-transcendence, self-actualization, but this deep binding coupling to the world that when one assumes a different identity in this way, it's like putting on a different pair of clothes so that the world appears a different way and different affordances are unlocked. That's what tied it over to Heidegger's notion of Dasein, the being whose being is in question. And so we were looking at Corbin's symbol of the divine double, sacred second self, or angel. Yep, and so we had the idea that this is obviously transgressive of our decadent romanticism through Rousseau, which is not this true essence, the self that we have, but that a self that is the angel out ahead, as Tom Chetham said, this that we aspire to become more like that process in a rational process of aspirational development that it's a cyclical breathing between finitude and transcendence. It's a Socratic model. Yep. And so it's transgressive. It's a transgressive mythology because it implies that the self that I have now is not actually the true self. So there's a way that this divine double is quote unquote more true to one's nature. It's something that is superlative, or even just define superlative. Yeah, best, superior, of highest quality. It's high or better or greater in some way. But it's also bound. So I'd simply say it has different capacities. I'm just sensitive to the risks here that this self is not real, and it is. It's bound both ways. So I think what I'm getting at here is that maybe it's possible that we actually haven't recognized that what we are is this relationship between a finite and transcendent self, small self and large self, to put it that way. And that the relationship itself is constitutive of who we are, and that relationship requires and presupposes both poles of the relata, neither of which can be preferenced. It's a little tricky because there is a normative preferencing. We are saying that one of them is more true in a certain way, but that doesn't, it's like we need the gods, but the gods need us. And it's like that doesn't make them not gods, but it's a little tricky to talk about. So this means that this existential project becomes not about expressing a self that we already have, but about becoming a self that is ecstatically ahead of oneself in an important way. I want to qualify here that I think that part of the whole point of what that transformation unlocks is a creative capacity. And I do feel that that is important. So, yes, I'm not wanting to fall into the decadent romanticism that John is pointing to, but I also feel that all along the way, at different steps of this transformation, there are creative affordances that are unlocked, expressive affordances that may be critically important as well, not instead of. Okay, now, yep, so we were looking here about John's just going through this. I'm just going through this in my own way. Yep, so we were talking about John was talking about aspirational development, a series of qualitative changes, not only transformative experiences, but ongoing, insightful transformation that is a rational process, and that we need that process of aspiration to be rational if we're not to get into a self-undermining position. That's logically, I think. Yeah. So if what allows us to become more rational is not itself rational, then our rationality is undermined in a self-contradictory way. So, okay, that's fine. So, what else? That's why it's connected to the cultivation of wisdom. And John talks about this. I mean, John did several episodes in like the early 40s of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis that tied rationality to wisdom that I won't be talking about here. It's part of the presumed context that there's a deep bond between rationality and wisdom and aspirational development, and that we see this. for him, that's about this rejoining of love and reason that's in Plato. Okay, now we need to talk about this non-logical identity a little bit more because it's a problem that we need to try to understand. Yep. To give the example of someone who wants to appreciate classical music more, so in doing it, they, the person who wants that, presumably they, rather than to impress their friends or anything like that, they appreciate it for a certain way of being. They want to become someone who can appreciate classical music. That involves seeing things, knowing things from a different perspective, and participating in being in a different way. And that's S2, that's the self after transformation that can appreciate classical music, right? And S1 does not have that. So there's a certain kind of perspectival and participatory knowing that is available to S2 that is not available to S1. It's not the same, that's why it's a non-logical identity. Yeah, so here's how we get into the paradox of self-creation. So yeah, so in order to, sort of create oneself from self one to self two, there has to be something continuous. Because if there's not continuity, then it's not self-creation. It's creation of something completely different. It's not the same self. On the other hand, yeah, there's a good example here of like if S1 is hit by a motorcycle and brain damage, then S2 is no, that's not an act of self-creation because um there's not a continuity. It's also not an improvement. So John's idea here is that, and this is through Strawson, that S1 has to be responsible for S2. Otherwise, it's not self-creation. It's simply it's discontinuous. But there has to be real novelty. Otherwise, there's no self-creation. And that's tricky. What do I mean by that? Yeah, so there has to be something really novel because it can't just be a development or of a skill or ability that is already that they already have because it's not really self-creation. It's not a fundamental difference. And so this seems paradoxical. He John gives an analogy from logic that I won't go into. What I'm wanting to get at here is, yeah, I'm going to comment in a minute, but I'm just outlining it a little bit more. We can see that in order to get real novelty between S1 and S2, you have to introduce something that's outside the logic of S1, the logic of its values and beliefs. So if it comes from outside of S1, then it appears as foreign and strange, and therefore it doesn't seem to be an act of self-creation. And so this is partly why there's no inferential way to get through this. It's a transformative process. You can't infer yourself from S1 to S2. It's a deeply participatory, existential leap of faith of going into this process of development that involves qualitative change to identity. And so the reason it becomes problematic is that we're stuck here. If there's discontinuity between S1 and S2, it seems that they're totally different, and so it's not an act of self-creation. But it's also true that There has to be something new introduced to S1. Otherwise, there's no way for S1 to transform itself. So it also couldn't be called self-creation. And so Jung links these to empiricism, and so that there is no self. All we're just a blank slate, and all that happens is the stuff from outside changing us. Or you can go the other way and say that you can become sort of Rousseauian romantic and say that the self is sort of identical throughout, and all you're doing is expressing what is already within. And so John feels that these are both unacceptable solutions, and Strawson feels that we have to choose between continuity and real novelty. And so John is agreeing with Agnes Callard here, who says this is all a mistake. Neither of them, neither the empiricist or romanticist perspectives are adequate. Is understanding that this relationship between S1 and 2 is one of non-logical identity. What do we mean by that? Yeah, so we're already practicing this kind of non-logical identity because we have these um, temporally extended selves. Like we say that I am the same as who I was a couple of days ago and a couple of years ago and a couple of years in the future. It's still me. This is a narrative identity that we have. And not only that we have, but that we are, that we take on. So John is just saying, he's expressing why neither of these positions help us. So it's not just that S1 is changed randomly into S2 from the outside, which would be only influence from the outside, right? And neither is it the case that S1 simply makes S2. It's not purely passive or purely active process. It's both. And this, again, we can see these themes here of non-duality, of involving both sides, of both finitude and transcendence here, passivity and activity, from the inside, from the outside, subject and object. Yeah, and again, this is why John is emphasizing participation through symbol. Yeah, so the way to understand it is that S1 does not receive or make S2, but participates in S2's emergence. And S2 emerges out of S1 to the point that S1 disappears into S2. So it's an emergent process, a process of emergence. And so Agnes Callard's name for aspiration is her name for that process by which S1 participates in the emergence of S2, such that S1 disappears into S2 and has become S2. Okay, just a couple of notes in passing is that there's this tension between me now and me then, and that could be S1 and S2. It's also that's a horizontal way in chronological time. There's also that me now and me then are both chronological incarnations that are in relationship as S1 to S2, who is higher in a verticality, that's a kairotic rather than a chronological way of framing it. And I want to say that I think this model of aspirational development is going to again apply in both directions. It is me now and me then in the future, but it's also me incarnated chronologically and drawing down the higher self and participating in Kairos at successive moments, and both of those as well. That's about that. And then I think there's implications that S1 ultimately disappears, and I think It may be that the form of the relationship stays. So it may be true to say that it's a leapfrogging process and that S2 comes to be in relationship with an S3, although that may not concern S1. Anyway, I'm going to leave that. And is there anything else? Yeah, it's the difference between like if we understand the importance of between finitude and transcendence, then the whole point of that is that we have to accept our finitude and work with that. And if I sort of map that over onto S1 and S2, then that doesn't quite line up with the idea that S1 ultimately is subsumed into S2. Because the whole point is that we can't be transcendent all the time. We have to also be our finite natures. And so I think there may be room for both of these at the same time as well. That one part of this could be a process of shedding, successively shedding layers of identity to assume a new identity and then assume another identity. But at the same time, that there's a rhythmic oscillating process while that's happening. And I don't quite know how else to express that at the moment other than to just notice that I think that's the case. And why don't we keep going? So we're hoping to then tie over this paradox of self-creation to the divine double, and that's what we're getting toward. Now, John is simply reformulating the problem through Callard. So, and this is super important because I think it's deadly relevant to what I was talking about at the start. Yep. So in terms of this relationship between S1 and S2, the actions that S1 takes are necessary and sufficient, perhaps, for setting forth a course of development that is going to result in S2, or they're not, as in our actions matter. So although it seems that S1 is prior in time, chronologically in time, this is S2 considered in the future. This would imply that S1 is before 2 in terms of the arrow of causation. S1 seems to cause S2 in this way. The opposite is the case normatively, in that S1 normatively depends on S2. What does this mean? It seems that S1's actions only make sense, can only be justified rationally once S2 comes into existence, because only S2 appreciates the music. So if I pause there for a second, I want to mention that it may be that S1, as our, let's say, current egoic selves, may need to realize that we are forced into a position because of situational awareness, that we need to act necessarily and sufficiently to set forth a certain course of development that is going to result in a process of personal transformation. I would say that has individual and collective dimensions, that is fractal in a scalar way, and that is in a sense an irrational process, but it's not if we understand that we are to be transformed into S2, and that S2 has certain capacities to respond to the situation that impels the necessary and sufficient actions by S1. As in, who do we need to be? Who do we need to be? So let's continue. So it seems that S1, yes, normatively depends on S2. We said that already. So it's really tricky because S1 causes S2 in terms of temporality, if we consider this chronologically. There's also a way that S1, if we consider it chirologically, meaning in terms of eternity rather than in terms of chronology, then S1 also causes S2 in the sense of S1 grounds S2 in time, here and now, in thrownness. So in that way, there's a way that even if it's considered vertically, S1 is still causally prior, but not normatively prior. And it may seem irrational because it seems that everything that the first self is doing ultimately only makes sense when the second self has come into existence. It's only after that process of aspirational development that the actions of S1 can be understood. What's interesting about that is the state that justifies S1's actions is the state of S1 having disappeared into the process of the emergence of S2, because only S2 understands and appreciates rationality. Okay, let's move on a little. So the normative primacy of S2 is where we find justification, explanation, and legitimation of the aspirational process. The fact of that person, the fact that they have become that which they are, justifies, explains, and legitimates that process of aspiration, which is difficult for us to grasp. And so John talks about this temptation here to be teleological and to think that S2 is a kind of uh, strange attractor that pre-exists us and that causes S1. And John thinks that that's actually present in the mythos of the divine double. And John's already argued that the teleological explanations are thwarting us in important ways. So there's a way that John is wanting to try and balance this by saying that S1 has causal power, but S2 has normative authority. So the question here that John is then asking is, if one considers oneself to be S1 and aspiring to be more like Socrates, for example, how does that S1 relate to that S2 which doesn't yet exist but has authority over me? How do I do that? And I think John was talking about aspiring to be like. So this is where we get this perspective taking stuff. So I'm going to continue here, try and get through this. But it's really important for me to try and understand this properly. Yeah, so it's not logically accessible, all right? So there's no way to infer my way to it. And so we have a representation of that future self, or we could say higher self. And the current representation has to somehow afford tapping into that process of development. It has to afford the transformation. So that's why it's really tricky here because we're looking for something very specific. We're looking for a representation of a chronologically future or kairotically higher aspired to self, and we're looking for a certain representation that has certain affordances, namely the affordance of transformation toward that aspired to self that allows one to become more rational and more wise. And in fact, then we could all, I think we would also have to say that has creative capacity that we do not have. Like there's some affordances that are available to S2 that are not available to S1. And I think it's rational to desire that and to recognize that. You want to be careful though of that it's for the sake of power. I'm not talking about power. I mentioned creativity. And I'm talking about creativity in the context of real problem solving in the world. I think it's also important to map this across um, transformation of individuals, rational development of individuals, and transformation of groups, rational development of groups, adherence of groups, creative capacity of groups. It's me that's mentioning that. Um, okay. Yep, let's continue. So, yeah, so the symbol is the kind of thing, it's an imaginary, in a sense, a representation, but it's not a representation, it's a symbol that affords that transformative process. Symbols do that. Symbols put S1 and S2 together in the right way. And it affords a kind of relationship between two things that are non-logically identical. And so that's something that can't be processed in a purely logical fashion, although it can be considered to be rational. So it's a representation, this symbol. And again, it's really important to get this is that this symbol appears to S1, appears to who we are. And S2 is not that symbol. With the symbol, which is the divine double, sacred second self, Socratic daimonion, Jungian anima, or Corbinian angel, affords a process of transformation and participation, aspirational development that is supposed to actually help going through that process to become more like S2. And the trick is that we don't actually know what S2 is like, but that we can look for what we consider to be more rationality and more wisdom. And I also mentioned more creative capacity, but I'm going to be careful about that. Like we're looking for good things to follow, basically. So we've clarified that the divine double is not S2. It's the symbol which bridges between S1 and S2 that appears to S1. So it's a representation or a symbol of the aspired to self, which is symbolic. And it can be internalized anagogically. It can be internalized. We can transcend ourselves by internalizing other people's perspectives on us. So we can internalize a certain perspective so that it becomes metacognitive. This affords self-transcendence. So the idea is that by taking up the perspective of a symbolic self, that a process of rational development toward greater wisdom, greater rationality is afforded. It's a rational process of self-transcendence. So that symbolic self is internalized. So what is internalized is something other than you, something other than one, but it becomes something that is identified as one. It becomes part of metacognitive, reflective rationality in the case of internalizing Socrates. We can see how if one were to internalize something a little bit less friendly than Socrates, that this is very much not a process of becoming more metacognitively reflective or rational. And that's why I think we're talking about a symphony of sages, that we do this with multiple perspectives and are in dialogue, in relationship, and that we know what rationality entails, what wisdom entails, what aspiration entails, and that we can be careful, full of care in the IFS sense of care and curiosity and compassion and like that, as well as being courageous. Okay, so why anagogically? So John goes on. So when we're internalizing a symbolic self, it's reordering the psyche so that we have a different way of being in the world. So there are different perspectival and participatory affordances that are unlocked. It's a new way of inhabiting the world. It's a new way of being in the world. So that's why there's a loop between internalization and indwelling. Internalizing Socrates and indwelling the world in a more Socratic way, which allows one to better internalize Socrates, to indwell the world in a more Socratic way. So it loops in that way, internalization and indwelling. Similarly with Christ. We can see here, I think, how flexible the self concept is. So that something that, I mean, the voice of the conscience was kind of originally like this, right? I mean, Jung was talking about this in terms of the Greeks, I think, that something that thoughts used to appear to come from the outside, right? That something that first appears to come from the outside can come to be internalized and assumed as an identity. I mean, this is really pointing to the ground of no self, right? That which is beneath perspective. So it's an anagogic process of internalization and indwelling that takes off of its own accord. It's not something that's just passively happening. It's not something that happens to one. It's a loop. And it's not something that one just makes happen. It's something that transcends, and I don't want to say transcends all duality, but it's a creative and receptive process. It's a process of participating. So S1 would require these capacities for both creative involvement and activity, engagement in the process, and receptivity and taking in, internalizing, and then indwelling the world in a different way. Yep. So John's talking about, so we have so that this symbolic self of which we're speaking, which is again a symbol of S2, and that symbolic self is something that we can take up, we can internalize its perspective, and what it does, what it affords, is the internalization of other perspectives. So it's a process of development that affords the process of development. And this makes the world more viable, makes the world more livable. it gives us also this flexibility with identity in a sense that we can be who we need to be by recognizing the situation that we're in, whatever situation that may be. By recognizing that situation, we can rationally orient to whichever kind of self one needs to be. I guess then I'm still concerned for what's the normative guideline, what's the normative through line on that? For what reason may one choose to internalize and indwell a certain perspective rather than another when we can't rationally know what indwelt affordances become available after the fact when we are in fact before the fact, if that makes sense. How do we know which direction to transform ourselves? How do we know who to internalize and indwell? I think this is where wisdom can help us. I mean, that we can look to people who are widely regarded as sages. And I think situational awareness can also, like, we have a sense of the capacities that are lacking that could be afforded. Yeah, I think we can also see that the one would be in a different position afterwards, as in if one were to internalize and indwell sagely perspectives widely regarded as wise, such as Socrates, such as Christ, such as Lao Tzu, like that, then from those perspectives, the world would appear differently, and one would be in a different position, let's say wiser and more rational position to assess things and to judge what direction to transform oneself into. As in, it's never a bad thing to become more wise. I can imagine urgency as a constraint, and that comes up as you want to be careful with that because, as Jordan Hall said, you want to be like James Bond defusing the bomb, and James Bond doesn't defuse a bomb while holding a martini in the other hand by rushing. He takes care. And where what I'm getting at is that the pursuit of wisdom could be it could be used as a kind of justification to avoid the transformations which are needed given situational awareness to afford, for example, survival. But I think, as I said, it's in almost all situations, it's because what I'm getting at, what an example of what I mean, right? So if you're in the jungle, and let me tell you, it's a jungle. It's a jungle out there. And if you're in a jungle, right, and you see a tiger coming towards you, tiger in the shape of the metacrisis, let's say. Oh, that's you gotta be careful with that though, because gosh, you gotta be really careful because it's a projection upon, the myth of the flood. Anyway, the point is, um, that's not the right time to become more wise. It's the right time to run away. I mean, I mean, it depends on maybe people would disagree. It's the best time to become more wise. Um, I think forsaking forsaking current wisdom for the sake of the continuance of the option to become more wise in the future is more wise than the alternative, which would be you gotta be careful. You gotta be careful at all the directions here. Man, that's such a tricky one. Okay, I'm gonna leave that. What I was talking about is what normativity is there on who to aspire to be, where there may be considerations other than wisdom, although wisdom is a pretty good, you know, constraint to have. So John is then saying that the divine double is pointing to that symbolic self. It's what he calls a mythos way of talking about that. And yes, it represents it in a linear narrative, and it simplifies it in a teleological sense, but we can also regard it as higher, that it's not only teleological, but it can be. I think it's very helpful for it to be, but chronological, now and then selves, and also kairotic, me now and in a higher way. Yeah, so John's very attuned to the fact that that teleology is simplistic. It doesn't necessarily capture the participatory nature of the transformation. And the danger of it is that it overemphasizes passive receptivity on the part of S1 in the face of S2. I think that's crucially important because if we're waiting around for the second coming, if we're waiting for Christ and his chariot of fire, or for there are different versions of this everywhere, don't worry, it's going to be okay because someone other than me is going to solve it. I mean, we see the classic example of this is in Harry Potter. I mean, for me, it's classic example at this point. But in the end of Prison of Azkaban, the third film of this, Harry's watching Sirius get sort of his soul eaten by Dementors, and they've traveled through time. And Harry's like, "Don't worry, my father's going to come up. My father is going to arrive and save himself and save Sirius." And Hermione's like, "Harry, no one's coming, dude. No one's going to come and save you. There's no one there." And Harry has this big realization, which is like, oh, it's me that has to step into that, into his own shoes, into the place that he projected his longing for the father. And notice how transgressive that is. Obviously, it's a story, but for Harry, look, I mean, there's a reason why that's inspiring, that story, because it speaks to us. Well, it speaks to me anyway. Harry steps in to those shoes, and that's how he unlocks the capacity to cast the Patronus and to save himself and to save Sirius. But it's very active, right? There was a realization that was attendant on no one is coming to save us. We are the people we've been waiting for. Who do we need to become? Okay, I'm gonna move on here. John keeps going. So John summarizes the mythos of the divine double is an imaginal way. It's an imaginal symbol that affords this dynamic coupling of anagogic ascent, anagogic transformation that allows one to participate in the act of self-creation in an ongoing relationship of aspiration. The divine double is you, but it's not you. It's the more advanced other that's been internalized into one and that eventually one becomes. That eventually one becomes. So eventually one lives differently in a new world. A different way of being becomes visible. It's a self that you will be, not the self that you are now. What he says is if there is no inkling in your current self, if there's no inkling of an identity that's possible and already beginning to be actualized between your current self and future self, then of course it's not going to be part of that aspirational process. So I think what he's pointing to here is that we actually already have an inkling of this. Yep. So this is what he means by transformative transframing. Yep. So this is what how he gets to speak about the divine double, right? The divine double is a symbolic representation of S2. It's not S2, it's a symbolic representation of S2. And the divine double as that symbolic self allows one to internalize from a more encompassing frame into current frame, which involves a shining in. That's what I meant. That's what they mean. Angels are glorious. It's shining in. So that's assimilation, internalizing from that greater frame. And that affords moving toward indwelling that more expanded world. So that framing is we can internalize from that framing and we move towards becoming by that internalization in such a way that we become the person, the being who can inhabit that world that we were internalizing from. So we move towards indwelling a more expanded world. So this is what he's it engenders a trans framing. Yep, and it's a co-transformation of self and world. It's a different identity is assumed. It's, and different affordances are, yeah, identities are assumed and assigned, uh, and different affordances are unlocked. The divine double shines the greater frame into the current frame, and it also draws one out by the way it withdraws. It draws one out by the way it withdraws into the more encompassing frame. That gives a sense of closing into one's own relevance, the relevance of oneself, but also opening into the greater self. So what is the gnosis here? John suggests that the divine double allows one to conform in process to the play of being, the way being itself is shining but also withdrawing, the same way that the angel is shining but also withdrawing. So there is a radical at one-ment between this process. There's a matching. It's between. It's like a dialogical relationship between self and being or self and world. This I think this my way of understanding that would be through Christ. It's kind of like this correspondence between the narrative identity of Christ, who Christ's person is, this alignment between that level and the level of his symbolic participation, who he is as a symbol. It's a fractal. There's something fractal about this. Yep. And so Being itself is shining and withdrawing, and the angel is shining and withdrawing. That makes it a process of, it affords radical self-transcendence in a way that allows one to become a greater or better self. Yep, so the idea is that the divine double is this central example of the imaginal, and that it's often represented in the mythos of angels. Okay. So we've seen how this divine double is transjective between subject and object, abstract and sensory. It's transframing. It allows one to expand to a greater frame through this internalization and indwelling. It's integrating the abstract, or the abstract form of, or a better concept of, the better self. So we have some abstract sense, but it's not just an abstract sense of the better self, but we're integrating that with our concrete action in the world. So they're drawn together, abstract and concrete. I think, yeah, there's more there because it's not just an abstract sense that we have, it's also a concrete and embodied sense, right? And what would that imply? It's also implying that we have an abstract and embodied or concrete sense of the better selves that we're trying to be, and that is matched to different actions, yes, concrete actions, but also different thoughts, different abstractions, which is, I guess, the whole point, that we can think differently in a certain way. It's not just subjective or objective, it's transjective, it's symbolic in nature and in action. It's an imaginal symbol, it's not just imaginary. Yep, so it affords true development, it affords the core of the being mode, which is not about having, it's about becoming someone. It's a deep interconnection between the sort of imaginal inhabitation of the world. This is so much what I meant about 4E re-ensoulment, unlocking gnosis and the being mode. Yep, so the angel in Corbin is a representation of the divine double. Yep, and so the thing to note is that for Corbin, everything has an angel. So significant. It's not only the agent that's being transformed, it's also the arena. The world is also opened up. Dreyfus, all things shining. So aspects of being are disclosing themselves that otherwise would not disclose themselves. Yep, so every object is shining and withdrawing into its mystery. Everything is a thing beyond itself. And so we could see, can we not see from here directly how this is so relevant to group process? It's also with things, everything is shining forth from itself, like the rose, physis, and withdrawing into itself. Aletheia, concealing itself and unconcealing itself. I'm also thinking of Eckhart breaking down and breaking through. We can see everything in its decaying quality and also in its living, it's breaking through as a quality of aliveness and presence that seem to go together in the notion of breaking through. Yeah, and then so that was about things, right? We can also see this with people, right? That there's a sort of, we're unlocking a certain imaginal world for a re-ensoulment of the world with people, with things, but then also with ideas, with virtues, and what have been called gods. Yeah, so the idea is that it's not just the imaginal that brings together not just thoughts and not just objects, but we're inhabiting an imaginal world that draws ideas down into personification, draws virtues down into angelhood, you could say, or toward the human condition, and draws things up into ensoulment. Yep, so that's what Corbin means by the angelic aspect or the angelic order of being. Yep, John doesn't want to use divine double. He gets, he starts using um, sacred second self. Yep, the Buddhists talk about Buddha nature, and in Vedanta they talk about Atman and Brahman. It's similar. He's pointing out that this aspiration is clearly seen in non-theistic religions. It's clearly in Gnosticism, which should not be interpreted theistically. And John's been trying to show that clearly the case in Neoplatonism, in Plotinus, and in Dionysus that is not theistic. So John doesn't want to use it because he doesn't want to connect it to theism. So he's calling it symbolic self, sacred second self, whatever you want to call it. And now we get to Jung. I think what I will do is pause and continue because there's too much here for me to put all in one episode. So I'm going to continue this in a minute.